So we're going to start right with the preschool storybook version of Daniel and the Lion's Den. Once there was a man named Daniel. Daniel loved God very much, and he tried to do what was right. He prayed to God every single day, morning, noon, and night. "Thank you, God, for taking care of me," Daniel would say. "Help me do the right thing." Daniel was very good and kind. Daniel worked for the king of that land, whose name was Darius. And King Darius liked Daniel because he always told the truth and he helped people. But some men didn't like Daniel. They were jealous and mean. "We don't like Daniel," they said. "The king likes Daniel too much. Let's get him in trouble." The mean men thought and thought. "I know," said one. "Daniel prays to God every day. Let's make a rule that people can't pray to God." The mean men went to the king. "King Darius," they said with a fake smile, "let's make a new rule. For 30 days, no one can pray to anyone but you. If they do, they'll have to be put into the lion's den." King Darius didn't know this was a trick. He said, "Okay, that's the rule now." When Daniel heard about the new rule, he had to choose. Should he stop praying to God, or should he keep praying? Daniel thought about it, decided, "God takes care of me every day," he said. "I'll keep praying to God." So Daniel knelt beside his window. Just like always, he folded his hands and he prayed to God. "Dear God," he said, "thank you for loving me. Please help me do good." But the mean men were watching Daniel's house. When they saw him praying, they ran to the king. "King Darius," they shouted, "Daniel broke the rule. He prayed to God. He must be punished." The king felt very sad. He liked Daniel a lot. But a rule's a rule, and kings have to follow their promises. "I'm sorry, Daniel," said King Darius. "You have to go to the lion's den. I hope your God will keep you safe." The king's helpers took Daniel to the den where the lions lived. The lions were big, and they had very sharp teeth. They were really hungry. They threw Daniel into the lion's den and put a big rock over the entrance so Daniel couldn't get out. That night, King Darius couldn't eat and he couldn't sleep. He was too worried about Daniel. When the sun came up, the king ran to the lion's den as fast as he could. "Daniel," cried King Darius, "are you okay?" "Yes," called Daniel from inside the lion's den. "God sent an angel to keep the lions' mouths shut. They didn't hurt me at all." And the king was so happy, he had his helpers bring Daniel out of the lion's den, and Daniel didn't even have a scratch on him. King Darius hugged Daniel. "Your God is amazing," said the king. The king was so mad, though, at the mean men for tricking him that he sent them into the lion's den. Unfortunately, the lions were very hungry. They hadn't eaten all night, and they ate them all up. From that day on, Daniel kept working for the king. He kept praying to God 3 times a day, and King Darius made a new rule. Everyone should love Daniel's God because he does amazing things. The end. So we're in this 9 colorful teaching series, and what we're looking at today is Daniel in the lion's den. And I always loved this story when I was a kid because, one, my name is Daniel, right? So you have to identify with stories that have your name in it. And the second reason was that I grew up in Michigan. And obviously in Michigan we have the Detroit Lions, right? So Daniel, Lions. And I was gonna wear what I thought was a Detroit Lions jersey. I had a Chris Spielman jersey. But I realized that this wasn't when Chris Spielman played for the Lions. It was when he played for the Bills. I also liked the Bills because my mom grew up outside of Buffalo. And Chris Spielman always interested me because, if you don't know who he is, he was a linebacker who played in the NFL. And my brother told me this story. I don't know if this is true or not, but Chris Spielman, before every game, he would go in the locker room, and to get motivated, he would think about the other team having kidnapped his daughter. And that was how he got motivated to be a great defensive linebacker. And I thought, that's a great story. This guy is super intense. He's very motivated, and he's a great player. And looking back on it, I think, wow, like, that's maybe not the best story that you should be creating up this motivation. But the reality is that the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell our community actually do matter, right? And we see this in the story of Daniel. I want to tell you a little bit about this book, the book of Daniel, because I think it helps us to understand that this community of people were trying to tell stories about how to live in a foreign land, how to be good Israelites living in a foreign land. In our Protestant English translation of the book of Daniel, you probably don't notice this because it's translated into English. The first chapter of the book is written in Hebrew, and then the 2nd through 6th chapters are written in Aramaic, and then chapters 7 through 12 are written again in Hebrew. What you probably also might not notice unless you're particularly observant is that the first 7 chapters are written in the third-person point of view, so the narrator is not a character in the story or telling the story as if he isn't a character in the story, and then chapters 8 through 12 are written in the first-person point of view, so the character Daniel is telling the story of I. And so this poses some interesting questions that we can think about the author and the shift in the language, the shift in the point of view, and we start to think about the purpose of this book. On top of that, what you don't see in your Protestant Bible typically is what I call editorial cuts, or maybe you might say they are deleted scenes in the book, or unaired episodes, perhaps. And what we know is that there are other stories that we can call Daniel material. And we see this in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which contains these other stories about the character Daniel and things that were going on in the Babylonian Empire at the time. One of them is this prayer of Azariah, one of the young men who's thrown into the fiery furnace. We see the story of Susanna. We see Daniel's contest with the prophets of Bel. We see Daniel's defeat of this dragon, slash serpent, slash beast, which leads to him getting thrown into another lion's den, which is a really fascinating story, which unfortunately we don't have time for. But then there's stories we also have from the Dead Sea Scrolls that are Daniel material as well. And what we should learn from this is that these people were telling a lot of these stories, trying to understand, how do I live in a foreign land? How do I maintain my identity? How do I maintain my religion? And it's important for us to understand from that one singular story wasn't enough, that our scriptures, our Bible, doesn't just have one story. It's not composed of one story. It's not just a rule book. It's a multiple stories that share people wrestling with their faith, their relationship with God, with their neighbors, their understanding of the world, among other things. When we look at Daniel, we start with chapter 1. We have to start with chapter 1 and understand that Daniel was a captive living in the city of Babylon. And what had happened was Daniel and these other religious and political leaders had been living in Jerusalem, and King Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE takes over the city of Jerusalem, and he exiles these religious and political leaders, takes them from Jerusalem and brings them to Babylon. Now, the purpose of the exile for the Babylonians, we take these religious and leaders, these political leaders, because they're influential. It creates a power vacuum in Jerusalem, so that the people who are living in Jerusalem can no longer revolt. And then they bring them to Babylon, and they teach them how to be good Babylonians. Creates an enormous amount of tension that we can see, particularly in our story, over identity and faith. When Daniel first arrives in Babylon, we see this in chapter 1, we see that he and his friends have their names changed. Daniel, his name goes from Daniel to Belteshazzar. And this name is a significant change for him. I don't have to tell you that names carry a significance, because we know that. We see that battle going on today. And just like Daniel, this name had significance. This name Daniel meant judge of God, or God is my judge. His Babylonian name, on the other hand, meant Bel protect the king, or Bel's prince. And so this tension that Daniel would have felt every day, hearing one name that referred to a different God, would have had to cause him to ask, who is God? Who is the true God? Is the true God the one that my ancestors, my family believe in, the people that they worship? Our land was taken over and we were brought into exile. Is that really the true God? Or is it the God of these Babylonians, these very powerful people? He would have felt this daily tension. Also, upon arrival in Babylon, Daniel and his friends are taken into the king's service, and they are instructed in the Babylonian language and literature. This isn't too dissimilar from our world today in that we still experience a battle over the things that we read and the language that we use. Psychologists have suggested that our language determines our thoughts, and those thoughts then, in turn, help shape our identity and who we are. In Daniel, we don't learn in what ways he's affected by the shift in language that he has to speak and the literature that he reads, but we do know that this probably did affect him. So we move from Daniel 1 to Daniel 6, and in Daniel 6, our main character is probably around 70 years old. He's been living in Babylon for quite some time, and he's done fairly well for himself. He's serving as a governor over a province in the Babylonian Empire, and despite being an Israelite, he's done a fantastic job. The text says, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was so trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, the men said, 'We will never find any basis for charges against this man unless it has something to do with the law of his God.'" And so what we heard in the story was that these mean men, as the story said, go to King Darius and they ask him to make this new law that no one can worship any god or pray to any human being for the next 30 days except for Darius, or they'll be thrown into the lion's den. And they say, "Now, Your Majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." When King Darius implements this law requiring no one to worship anyone but himself for a month, Daniel doesn't even question what he'll do. He does what he's always done, that which aligns with his identity, which is he goes to his room and he prays, just as he's always done. And we don't get specifics on what he prays, but we do know that he gives thanks to God and he asks him for help. Reading this story, we probably think, Daniel, there's an easy workaround. There's an obvious workaround. Just don't pray for a month. If you can pray to no one but the king, just don't pray at all. Or maybe, Daniel, just pray more secretively. Daniel doesn't seem to care, however, if he breaks the rule or not. He just does what he's always done. Prayer and relying on God has become essential to his identity, so he thanks God and asks him for help. But we know Daniel gets caught by these jealous accusers, these mean men, and he gets brought before King Darius, and we have this interaction between the king and the accusers, which helps us to understand a little about their law and about the power of the king and the government. It's said that the rationale for not pardoning Daniel, because the king seems to like Daniel, the rationale for not pardoning Daniel and changing the law is that it was written down. And a law that was written down couldn't be changed in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. To us, we might think, well, this seems ridiculous. It's a bad law. Bad law is a bad law, and we try to change, and we try to fight them. This idea of changing bad law and changing bad government, it's embedded in our foundational documents. We see this in the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrated on Friday. This document tells us that it's not only our right, but it's our duty to change bad laws and bad government. But this didn't exist for King Darius in the ancient world. King Darius is hamstrung by the law because of how government was viewed. What we see in Daniel is a mockery of an autocratic government that has perceived divine rule. The idea of divine rule is that the king has been put in place by God. So, in a sense, the God is working through the king. If such is the case, then the laws made by the king have effectively been made and sanctioned by the God. So the king changing this law would be him going against not only himself, contradicting himself, but also contradicting his God. Pardoning Daniel or changing law doesn't seem to be an option for Darius. However, we see this still affects the king. It seems that he wants to help Daniel. After they brought Daniel to the king, the text says, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. And what strikes me there is the words greatly distressed. The king was greatly distressed. It's here that we see a shift in the story, because up to this point it's been just about this character Daniel. And now we see that it's not just about Daniel. This is also about Darius. Darius, the king of Babylon, one of the most powerful persons in the world, was distressed, was bothered by what was happening to one of his Israelite men who worshiped a different God who'd been living in his city. Simply put, kings don't get distressed over the fate of their subjects. So why is Darius distressed? And I think if we look into it, we can see that there's something else at stake besides just worrying about this one man that gives Darius a reason to care about what happens. The text says, so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him in the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. One of the things that strikes me there is the you and the your. He says your God. He says Daniel's God. He's not saying our God or my God. It's your God. Darius has no personal experience with this God, and he doesn't know what this God is capable of. Darius has his own gods, right? And he probably has good reason for thinking that these are the gods that I should worship. If we think back of that ancient mindset of divine rule, the king was put in place by God. That was the thought. Darius must have been liked by the God, otherwise he wouldn't be king. So in Darius's eyes, his power and his success proves the existence of his God, and as such, Darius should worship this God. This is the God that gave me power. I should worship this God. The text continues, the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he couldn't sleep. Various translations use some different words here, and I think it might help us to see what some of those other words are. Some of the translations don't just say that he didn't eat. Some of the translations say that he fasted. And there's a big difference between not eating and fasting. Not eating maybe means that Darius, he didn't feel very well, and maybe he felt guilty about what had happened, or he was nervous about what was going to happen to Daniel. But the fasting is a little bit different from just not eating. Fasting gives us this impression that maybe Darius is doing this spiritual practice as a supplication, a prayer to his God to save Daniel. Then the word normal entertainment, we can see that this means anything from musical instruments to diversions to dancing girls, and then most interesting, concubines. This King Darius, I picture him coming home, going to his palace after a hard day's work, and he's brought all of these carnal pleasures in front of him. He's brought wine, and he's brought food, and there's this band that's playing maybe for him. And then these girls come in, and Darius is not interested at all. This king who's been living probably a life of pleasure no longer cares about that. Why? Is he wrestling with the law he made? Is he wrestling perhaps with the way he's been living? We have to wonder, maybe it's more than that. Maybe he's wrestling with the idea of who is God? Who is the God that I should worship? And then it said that Daniel couldn't sleep that night. Imagine a king not sleeping at night. All over one man. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Again, look at the language. Darius hurried, and he spoke in an anguished voice. I don't see a king hurrying very often or being anguished about one of his subjects. Darius has become emotionally and spiritually affected by Daniel's bold decision to defy the king. Daniel responds, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I done you any wrong, your majesty." And as we heard, the story ends with King Darius letting Daniel out of the lion's den and throwing in his accusers into the den, and along with their wives and children, which is a little aggressive. And then Darius issues this decree that everyone must fear and respect Daniel's God. And it's a great story, right? It's a great story. I loved this story growing up. But I always approach this story as the story of Daniel being saved from the lion's den. And that has some great lessons in it. And I don't want us to miss those, because those really are important. We see one, hold on to your identity and who you are. Daniel refused to assimilate the important parts of himself to the dominant culture. What we know is that people around us are always trying to influence us in 100 ways. Whether we're living in a foreign land or whether we're living in our own. We should, as the text says, stay true to who you are. Number 2, hold on to your faith in the God that can save when no one else can. We learned last week in the story of David and Goliath, that verse from Psalm 20. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Daniel was willing to sacrifice his life, his physical life, through his devotion to God. He, as the writer of Revelation, said he didn't love his life so much that he wasn't afraid to die. He didn't love his life so much that he was afraid to die. Simply put, we don't throw away our faith when times get hard. We lean in. When we do that, we strip away so many superfluous things in our lives that might have mattered before, but they don't matter now. And then 3, if you stay true to who you are, you stay true to your faith, things will work out for you. Throughout this story and others in the book of Daniel, we see that despite the challenges, Daniel actually succeeded in his life in Babylon because he held on to his identity and he held on to his faith. Now, that might not always be the case for us, that things might not always work out for us, but it gives us hope that we persevere in our daily lives. We are a people of hope. And those are great lessons. Those 3 lessons, those are great lessons. But if we just focus on Daniel, we miss a huge part of the story, which is about Darius. This isn't just about Daniel being saved from the lion's den. It's about Darius being saved spiritually, starting the process of being saved spiritually. Through Daniel, Darius questions the way he'd been living and the gods he'd been serving. And Darius begins to encounter a new way of life. Let's look at this edict that Darius has at the end. "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lion's den." If I read those verses out of context from what we've been talking about and told you that that was in Psalms, you would have believed me, because that's the same type of language that we see there. And we consider the language of this edict that Darius gives compared to the language that he used earlier. Darius earlier had said, "your God," Daniel's God. And this then becomes, he is the living God. Darius experiences the spiritual revelation, which is a bold move in the narrative. It's a bold resolution. The actions and the faith of Daniel caused a change in the king of Babylon, a man who had immense power and could have lived any way that he wanted. As you read through the story, if you read it on your own, one of the things that you'll see in the book of Daniel, particularly in the first 6 and 7 chapters, is that there's very little animosity toward the Israelite overlords in the text. We have to remember this, Daniel and the other Israelites had their temple destroyed by these people. They were taken into captivity, 750 miles from their home, and forced to assimilate into another culture. Regardless of this fact, very little hatred is shown towards the Babylonians. And they'd have every reason to do so, right? And this is important. They did not hate them. The author of Daniel does not hate the Babylonians. By the standards of society, they had every reason to hate them, but they didn't. Instead of hating them, they hoped for them. Why does it matter? Martin Luther King Jr. said in his sermon, Loving Your Enemies, he said, if you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem them. That sermon that King preached was based on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in which he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. We have to understand this different way of living for us. God doesn't just love Christians. God doesn't just bless Americans. God doesn't just want good things for the people who show love and mercy in this world. He wants good for all people. And that's an important thing for us to remember, because that shapes how we view people and how we interact with them. Again, that verse said, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. We live in this dichotomy in our world where you're enemy or you're the neighbor. And it's restrictive, it's debilitating, and it's exhausting. What Jesus says is that those so-called enemies, they're people to love and they're people to hope for. And that's what we see in the story of Daniel in the lion's den as well. Briefly back to that story is considering what is it that causes Darius to change? What does Daniel do? What we don't see in the story from Daniel is we don't see a sermon. We don't see a diatribe. We don't even see Daniel say anything until Darius visits him in the lion's den, when he says, may the king live forever. The reason that Darius changes is not from Daniel's words, but it's from Daniel's actions. Darius sees that Daniel actually believes the things that he says he believes in, and he lives his life as a reflection of that. And that's important, because what it teaches us is that our actions and how we live actually matter. Daniel lives out his faith. He does what Francis of Assisi later says, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. So when we see that this isn't just a story about Daniel in the lion's den, but it's also about Darius, it's that fourth lesson that we can see in the story that's really important. The way we live matters, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. We have incredible power in this world to change the people by the way we live. It's done by how we treat people. It's done by how we view people. The truth is, as we know, we cannot change the others in this world or the world itself if we are not changed from within. We cannot hope to change so-called enemies, making them think they need to live lives of love, mercy, justice, and truth, if we ourselves are not trying to live lives of love, mercy, justice, and truth. And we cannot hope that those so-called enemies love us if we don't ourselves try to love our so-called enemies. And we cannot hope to make this world look more like Jesus if we are not ourselves trying to make this world look more like Jesus. Obviously, that's challenging because, like Daniel, we live in this contentious, divided world where we have 100 problems. We're fighting over so many different things, and it's easy to feel like we should just give up. We give up on other people, our so-called enemies, and we even give up on ourselves, our identity, and our faith, and that's a challenge. But even though we are the call to live like Daniel is hard, the good news is that we don't do it alone. Just like in this story, we, like Daniel, should ask that the God who can save a man from the lion's den can change a king's heart and change our hearts as well. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this opportunity to share this text with Southeast today. We have so much to learn about the way you want us to live in this world. And we follow the example of Jesus of loving, of serving, by trying to make this world a better place. It's your name we pray. Amen.